Recently, there's been a bit of discussion regarding player choice and how game design can influence it. From things as minor yet still obnoxious like slathering yellow paint on walls, to things that would affect massive quest lines in RPGs. And with the Shadow of the Erdtree DLC announcement, I couldn't help but be reminded of the Elden Ring discussion. Namely, the discussion involving people describing Elden Ring as a Ubisoft or Bethesda open world game, except with a more trimmed down UI. Going as far to state that Souls fans would absolutely love Ubisoft and Bethesda games if they just, trimmed down the UI. The statement is fairly true, although it isn't entirely accurate. The Souls series had a tendency of not telling its players what to do in various situations, or if they do say something, it would be very vague or locked behind a miracle. It was practically a roll of the dice whether or not certain actions would affect a character's questline, and the way that these questlines would unravel rewards the player for thinking as opposed to shoveling story down their throat. To show this, I will be comparing Dark Souls to Far Cry 4. Both of them don't support multiple saves within a single run, emphasizing an aspect of permanence on player decisions, and both of them from a narrative perspective show pros and cons to both sides of a conflict. This does mean that I am going to be spoiling a lot of the main plot of Dark Souls as well as Far Cry 4. First, we will be going over the main storyline. For those who are uninitiated, the game revolves around Ajay, a person who is supposed to be the new leader of Kyrat after his father died. However, being a foreigner, he doesn't know the values of Kyrat and he doesn't know what's best for them, so he needs to choose someone to become his consigliere. The candidates presented to him are Amida and Sabal. Amida wants to make plantations in which child slaves are forced to make drugs. On the other hand, Sabal is so traditional that he decides not to raise the age of consent, as well as having very puritanical views in terms of punishment. This dichotomy is the crux of the story for at least a third of the missions in the game. The game also shows you bits and pieces of these moral quandaries as opposed to dumping it all on you at once. The player isn't told which side is right and which side is wrong, meaning that their choice is their choice. Something one would think a Souls fan would like. However, in execution it feels extremely railroady and limited. I don't necessarily think that having the icons on which character is where is even the issue here. The biggest issue I have with it is it's not interactive enough. For example, Amida wants to grow a lot of drugs, so naturally she wants Pagan Min's poppy fields. However, Sabal thinks that it's poison to his people, so he wants to destroy it. The player has to preemptively choose which path they want to take before they're even halfway through the mission, which is when you should start burning down the fields or saving them, depending on whose path you took. Instead of immersing the player by making their choice matter, they have a big yellow flashing sign that says, "Do this objective." One of the other things that this mission could have benefited greatly from is having no fail state. Instead of looking at the developer's intentional railroad tracks, think about what would happen logically. If you side with one of them and fail, then the other wins, earning the favor of the nation more and more as a result of their success. Or at the very least, the loser's soldiers would have a decrease in morale. It also encourages the player to get better at the game, assuming they were planning to back their candidate all the way. In Dark Souls 1, a lot of the characters would have quest lines that end in them becoming hollow. However, that doesn't need to be the case for most of them. This, combined with the fact that you cannot natively save scum, greatly increases the impact of consequence on a player. This isn't to say that all fail states should be recognized by the game. Rather, the developers of Far Cry 4 set up something that could have been far greater than what we actually got. Ultimately, the reason why choice is so important in these types of games is because it allows a player to express how they feel about the aspects of the game, in terms of its lore, story, and presentation. It's a way for the developer to say that they're open to both criticism as well as multiple different interpretations of the characters. In fact, one of the biggest reasons why people replay Dark Souls is because players like these characters so much that they want them to thrive. Though I may come off as rather critical of the game, I'd be remiss if I weren't to mention the instances in which it does facilitate player choice. Unlike Dark Souls 1, the progress a player has made isn't reset at the end of the game, framing the player character's following actions as ones taking place after the main story. Before the final mission of the game, the player is tasked with killing off the leader of Kyrat that they didn't choose. However, if they spend a little bit of time thinking and realize that they don't want to support the person they've been backing all this time, they have the option to just not pull the trigger. This binary option has been presented in multiple games in the past, including the Far Cry series itself, with the 3 ending being based off of whether you pull the left or right trigger to spare or kill your friends. The issue with the vast majority of them is that they would show big button prompts for action that the player has taken throughout the entire game, such as melee attacks or shooting somebody, instead of it being integrated into gameplay more naturally. This would be accompanied with text that outlines the choices as good and bad respectively. The product of these factors is a rather poor presentation of these choices.
Kill the cunt, save the bae. Keep her alive, kill everybody else. Gee, I don't know if I can decide between the...
Ding dong, the witch is dead. Which will reach the wicked witch. Ding dong, the wicked witch is dead.
But back to how this affects the post-game. The markers for the leaders, Amida and Sabal, are nowhere to be found on the map. The player would have to remember what their interests are. Amida needs more people to work her palpy fields, so naturally she's going to be kidnapping children. Sabal likes touching children, so obviously he's going to be at a holy site. You'll be seeing one abusing child slaves and the other executing heretics, respectively. You're shown the full results of your actions and how it affects the nation. From there, you can decide to kill either of the leaders if you disagree with how they're running things. And if you spared the other person you were supposed to execute, they would become the leader of Kirat instead. Alternatively, if you wanted to double down on your decision, you can kill the person who you initially hesitated to kill. One of the first things the player is taught in Dark Souls by the Crestfallen Warrior is that you have to make your own choices in who you want to be aggressive towards. A relationship with some people is just not worth it. Though there are no items to be rewarded to the player for doing any of these things, I still think that a FromSoft fan would like these quests more than the others. The player had to use both their knowledge and logic to find out where these two people were. The side quest being locked off from people who did pull the trigger makes the world feel more consistent and more like it actually exists. On top of that, there's no forced cutscene to show the drama of the other leader taking control. It's only relegated to an optional NPC dialogue. The fact that almost everything about this quest is entirely optional emphasizes the idea that the developer is scratching the back of the player for caring about their world so much.